audience, I think everybody was here in the 70s or somewhere in the 70s. It seems like a long time ago. We actually had a program on the 70s only 15 years ago, and that already seems a long time ago. Now it's really history. But it's fun about doing the decade that we've lived is that you can participate, you know about the time, you saw it happen, and everybody has a different perspective on it. It's not some book you read somewhere. So that's what the show is about tonight. And it's our annual meeting, so we have to have a very short business meeting. And I've reduced the business part by just saying that the minutes from the last meeting will be on our website, so you can read it there. And the financial report is over there in the stack. You can read that over there, and that is put together by Clive, and the minutes are put together by Jenna Jenkins, who is our secretary. We do have to do our slate, and we have a nominating committee. So that would be Elka. Could you read the slate for officers for next time?
Okay. Nominating committee is Janet Long, who was unable to be here, and myself, Elka. And we have a bit of a change from our usual slate. We hope this is okay with our bylaws. We're combining the president into a co-president and having two. And it would be Willie Smith and Nancy Hill. Thus, there's no VP. I'm not sure why, but it seemed like a good idea when we were working on this. The secretary continues to be Jenna Jenkins, and the treasurer continues to be Clyde Gray, wherever he is, if he's here. He is not, but he's okay with it. Martha Nemi is returning as a trustee, and B.J. Gray is a new trustee.
Okay, are there any nominations from the floor? Please.
I move we accept the report of the nominating committee.
Okay, I guess I need to ask for a motion to accept the report of the nominating. All those in favor, say aye. All those opposed, so I guess that is carried. So I also want to thank our outgoing trustee, Tom Anastasio, because he has been our tech person for several years now, and he has developed what I never knew was possible, but it's obviously a use for it. Our website is not just an information website where you see how old the society is and who are the trustees and maybe a history of Greensboro. He's also putting research tools on that website. So we have the whole cemetery census, which his wife Jenna put together. And we have on it all the tapes of old-timers talking, of these meetings that he's been recording all these years. So you can always go to the website and see all the meetings, all the people who talked. The other really clever thing is getting all the genealogical information we have about people in Greensboro on the website. And he worked with some students at Lyndon State, and they wrote the program. It's on the website, but we haven't scanned in the information yet. But as soon as that's scanned in, and the Greensboro Association gave us money through a grant to pay somebody to do all that scanning. So it's not like who is related to whom, but it is, you look up a name and you can get all the information that we have about that person. So articles in the paper, anything they've done in Greensboro. So it's a research tool, which is, it's just a huge, interesting website because of that. So thank you, Tom, for putting all that work together. And we're looking for a new tech person. We'll teach them the ropes. And thank you, Jenna, for working on that also, and also for doing the exhibit this year. Our exhibit is on health, if you haven't been over there yet. We have lots of great information about the health system in Greensboro, the Northern Counties Health Center generally, and the hospital before that. And that is also a phenomenon, having a rural health center like this. not many places have it. Rural areas have it, but you can't get this kind of service in a city, for instance. So she's put together the Vets exhibit. So go over there and see that. The hours, everybody look at the green sheet. The hours for the museum are there. And then we have a huge thank you to Gail, who has put together the Hazen Road Dispatch Anthology, which is a 40-year anthology of all the magazines that have been written by the Greensboro Historical Society. And we have it for sale tonight. And she had several editors. They met for over a year. They got lots of extra photographic material and exhibits for the magazine. So that's a big thank you to Gail for putting that together. We're going to have a launching of the magazine Wednesday night at 7 o'clock at the Guard tent, where some of the authors will be there and the editors will be there, and Tim Breen will lead a discussion on the magazine.
May I add something?
Yes, please.
The founding editor of the Hazen Road Dispatch is Daniel
It's right
Metro.
here.
He's here tonight, and there wouldn't have been such a publication without him.
And 40 years ago, what year did we start? 75?
December 74, actually.
Okay, December 74. And that was, and I think it's a pretty amazing magazine for a small historical society to have been put out for that, published for that many times. Then we have another great thank you to Jenny Stoner, who every year puts out 2 newsletters. And it's, again, full of information about our society, and it has an envelope for membership. So you pick up one of those, you can read all about our exhibit, about, it has a great president's column this year, and about this program.
Next year, will there be a co-president's?
There'll be a co-president's column, yes. That'll be fun. Gosh, I hate to not thank everybody. Everybody in the society does all the little jobs. It's just amazing. There's just always something to do, and somebody jumps in and does it. I did also want to mention Clay Simpson's memoir writing workshop. That's also Wednesday. It's at 2 in the afternoon, and it is in the Guard tent. So is the launching of the HRD. And that is together with Alan Davis. And then our exhibit next year will be about the China hands in Greensboro, which is about time that we had a huge exhibit about them. There are sort of not too many left. So, but we have a lot of written material, a lot of artifacts, and Clay will be in charge of that exhibit. So now I would like to introduce the program. You all know that the Vermont Historical Society has been doing 70s, and they will be doing it for another year, I think. They go around to the communities, and in every community we have these fora, and people get up and talk about their experiences in the 70s. So I thought I would do it here because we weren't on their list, and then this information can go to Vermont too. And Leslie Rowell has been working with the Vermont Historical Society. She's over there on this project. And if you want to know more about that, it's at their website, vermonthistory.org/Vermont70s. So that's and we sort of want to take over that format too. We have 4 panelists here who were living the 70s life, and let's just start with David Allen. He's in the first seat. David Allen, how shall I introduce you? He's a local. He's a Vermonter, and he's sort of the bridge between the hippies that came in and the local Vermonters, because he had a vegetable farm. He turned his father's dairy farm into a model vegetable farm and ran it for many years on the Hardwick Street. And I know Highland Lodge couldn't have done without it. We got vegetables from him every day for years and years and years. And if we ran out, we just ran over there and we'd pick some, or he would pick them, or whatever. So why don't you start, and then I'll introduce the next person. I'll read this.
Sure.
He knows all about the food movement in the area.
Well, I'm not exactly sure what I'm supposed to say here, except that we did started with lots of vegetables. It was a dairy farm, and I had no intention of being involved in dairy whatsoever. I left never to return because I didn't like cows and they didn't like me, and we had an agreement. I'd stay away from them and they'd stay away from me. And I ended up, after getting out of school, coming back to help my parents out, basically, because my younger brother was going to take over the dairy farm and decided not to. And it was kind of leaving them in the lurch. And I had enough of school, so I was looking for some time off and just away from school. And I decided that they had spent by that time it had been 22 years taking care of me, that I could easily take a year or two and get them used to the fact that there was not going to be a dairy farm there any longer, because I wasn't interested, and I was going to just help them through the transition. While I was doing the transition, what I was interested was in grains. So I immediately started planting rye and oats, and buckwheat was my first year that I did grains. And I went to the Champlain Valley and purchased a combine and had that trucked in, and combined all these grains. And at that time, there actually was a milling facility in Plainfield. And so we combined the rye, and we milled the rye in Plainfield and sold it through the co-op system, which was just getting started. And it turned out to be, I guess, the first rye that had been grown, milled, and sold in Vermont since the late 1800s, which is what I was told. And we took the oats. I ran it at that point in time. There was a gentleman at that point in time, there was a gentleman that was moving into the area working for NOFA. He was trying to get grains, local grains, into the co-op system. That was Robert Fourier. And he put an ad in the paper for people to raise grains. And I was already doing so, so I went to the meeting along with, must have been 10, 12, 14 other people there, met him, and he ended up buying the 8 acres of oats that I already had in the ground. And that was quite a wild story, because we had to, there was a milling, there was a mill in Plainfield, as I said, for the rye, but there was no mill closer than Pennsylvania for oats, because they had to be hulled and rolled, and that was a much more complicated process. The closest roller facility was north of Montreal. So we had to take this grain, these oats, out of the state of Vermont into Canada and back into the U.S. And you couldn't do that without exporting, importing, if it was food for people. So if it was animals can cross the border, farm machinery can cross the border, north-south without any problems. So we simply lied. We loaded the truck up and went through the border and told everybody at the border that we were hauling and rolling oats, and we were going to bring them back and feed them to pigs. See if they did better on all rolled oats than they did on straight feed. And nobody cared. In those days, there was no smuggling that anybody was aware of. I'm sure it was going on. But on our way back, the U.S. people were not about to buy that story hook, line, and sinker. And so we got caught up at the border. And luckily, we were there for quite some time. They were not buying the story whatsoever. And luckily, Robert Fourier was sick. I mean, sick as a dog. He could barely speak. His nose was running nonstop. His face was swelling. And he really needed to be someplace other than sitting in an office at the border. And this one border agent would not let us through. And he said, I don't know what you think you're doing, but I don't believe this story, and you better come up with a better story. We said, oh, no, we're doing this for the pigs, and this is what we're doing. And luckily he went off. His duty was over. And a new guy came on, and we're sitting there and going, how long is this going to go on? And one of the secretaries walks up, and she said, get these guys out of here. They're going to make us all sick. And sure enough, the new guy looks around, and he says, okay, what are you guys doing? I said, well, we've just hauled these oats up to Canada. I had them hauled and rolled, and we're bringing them back, and we're going to feed them to the pigs. And when we started saying feed them to the pigs, he went, feed them to the pigs. And we said, yeah, that's correct. He said, well, I don't know what you guys are doing, but okay, let's go. Out we go. We opened up the first bag, and it was oats that had been hauled and rolled and partially cleaned. We opened up the second bag, and there was probably 150, 160 bags in there. We're going, oh my God, where is this going? After 3 or 4, he said, I have no idea what you guys are doing. I don't believe you one bit, but get the hell out of here. So, and we jumped in the truck and we took off. And, nowadays you probably have to open every single bag that was there because they were expecting something. And anyway, so that's when I met Robert Hurry, because he was doing a project for the co-ops to try and get local grains in. And he had spent a lot of time in the Champlain Valley, lower Champlain Valley, where Howard Prusak and a lot of other small farmers were doing vegetable stands every summer. And that's what he was into. He really wanted to get vegetables going up here. I was looking for something to do. We were not going to do cows, and I was going to be moving on. And so I threw in with him, and we started Vermont Northern Growers Co-op. And it turned out, I guess it was one of the first organic producer co-ops that was incorporated in the Northeast anyway. I don't know about across the country, but we learned years later from a gentleman out of Washington that came up to give us some advice that we were the first in the Northeast to incorporate an organic producers co-op. And all we intended, all we were producing then, was carrots in the summer, beets, and potatoes. That we could grow them all summer, harvest them, put them in the potato storage facility, the old Batten potato storage facility in East Hardwick, and then we'd have all winter to sell them, because we obviously couldn't afford to hire anybody to process and sell. So we could do the entire process ourselves, grow in the summer, clean, package, and sell in the winter. And from there, it just kind of snowballed. There were six or eight other people that got involved in Vermont Northern Growers, and we ended up with 35, 40 tons of product in that building after a couple of years. And it spiraled from there, and then I left, and George Crane, the infamous George Crane, was a major part of that. And that's a great story around George, but unless somebody asks, I won't even bother to tell it. And so it kind of snowballed from there. And it was appealing to people that were moving into the area, particularly if they didn't know how to farm. Dairy was the only thing, but if you had purchased 5 acres and had a house and wanted to be a homesteader, the back to the landers, it was something you could do with your land without spending much money. You could get the local farmer to plow it and harrow it, and then if you bought yourself a rototiller, walk behind rototiller, you could start to produce a crop that would pay taxes, and if you were lucky, maybe go a little bit beyond that. And it just kind of kept growing and growing, and then most everybody was intending to be a small farm. And then folks like Pete Spreens came along, and his intent right from the get-go was to be as big as he possibly could. And he's doing a heck of a job at that. He's getting bigger every year and better every year. And so there's it's quite a movement with people wanting to be small, stay small, just hit the farmer's market and sell to the local businesses. And we go to Burlington and Montpelier and stuff. And then there's the folks that intend to make a major industry out of it that ship all over New England. So, and then of course there's all the trials and tribulations around that, good years, bad years, and the whole 9 yards. So that's basically the story that I have to tell. So, what's that? The Buffalo Mountain? Yeah, I was probably one of the earlier members, but I was not one of the people who formed it. I joined because we were looking for places to sell, and so I joined the co-op, and we were selling, and our products were going there. And other people would have more things, better, more extensive information about the forming of Buffalo Mountain and the other co-ops around. So, okay, thank you.
A representative from Walden, Standard, and Hardwick in the Vermont legislature. And he has lived here since the early 70s, I think. And he was a Vietnam veteran. And he has always been in local government in Standard. And has studied how the 70s movements affected life today in Vermont. And would you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Willie. The first thing I wanted to speak about was how wonderful this oral history of Vermont is. Oral history, Native Americans perpetuated their tribal customs and whatnot through oral history. Many ancient societies perpetuated their stories and their history through oral history. So I'm really thrilled to be part of this evening. And so I guess I'll start my story in 1970. Some friends of ours bought some land in West Glover, and we came to visit Vermont for the first time in June of 1970. We had just gotten out of college, packed the VW van and headed for Glover, West Glover. So it was we were just thrilled to be here. And we lived in Berkeley for a short period of time, back to New York, but everything from 1970 to when we bought our place in Stannard in 1972, July 5th, 1972, was directed toward coming back to Vermont. We just loved the place right away. It just took us in, and there was, Berkeley was really nothing compared. So the things that struck me early on when we got here were politics. And I don't know if that has a lot to do with my present position. I think it did. I was so taken by Vermont's access to politics, small politics. The first town meeting I went to, and I thought to myself, you vote for the school budget? You vote for the road budget? This is wild. This is unbelievable. I mean, I had been political in New York, and I had, as Willie mentioned, I had served the combat tour in Vietnam. I came back and was not convinced that that was really a good situation there. So I turned against the war, and I spent a number of years in New York protesting against the war and in certain actions against the war. So I had a political thing going. My father was a lifelong Democrat. He was a local committee man, so I grew up in a household where political conversation was generally the topic of most dinners, and my father was a local committee man, so I grew up going to Boy Scout meetings and picnics in the Democratic Club and that sort of thing. So I had this wonderful, this really great interest in politics, and when I got here, it was like, wow. So we started looking for some land, and the first person that we looked with was Emory Hebard. Now, I'm sure by the reaction, of course, everyone remembers that. Em was a great guy. And he drove a Rambler. He's a frugal man. And he would take us out into Irisburg and Orleans County and all through. He would give me my first political lesson in Vermont. And that was, we're frugal and we're socially aware. And you know what? Over the 43 years that I have lived here, that has stayed with me. And in my freshman session in the State House, it stayed with me to a point where that was where I determined the principles of government in Vermont were. So that worked out really well. We got to Stannard. We had a milk cow, little Jersey, named Annie, and we hand-milked her and raised all our own meat, most of our vegetables, a lot of garlic. So it was genuinely a back to the land movement. When we left New York and arrived here in northern Vermont, we were so, the second thing we were so impressed with is the connection with your life, your day-to-day life, with the production of your food, with the heating of your house, with the support of your neighbors. This past session, I had the great privilege of bringing Una Lou Richardson to the State House and introducing her, because her father was the last person in Vermont, from Stannard to hold a seat in the House of Representatives. And he fought against reapportionment in 1965, which sent him home. So I thought it was appropriate to bring his daughter to the State House and introduce her to the members of the legislature. And it was wild, because she brought her daughter and her grandson. So it represented 4 generations of Standardites. And I was it was thrilled to do it, and she was thrilled to be there, and we had a really great time. So, you know, Wayne, part of the story that I told at that time was how Wayne Richardson came to us and said, you know, I think you guys are here to stay. And he was like thrilled to have neighbors that when he had a cow down, he'd come and get us, and we'd help him get the cow up. When we had our tractor stuck, he'd come and pull our tractor out with his tractor. So we had this incredibly great relationship with this neighbor, which lasted until, you know, the day he died, and maintains with Lou and Karen and the rest of his family, who still are on the original Hutchins farmstead, which is about a half a mile or so down from our house. So over the years, we began making sugar. And the other interesting thing to me, of course, is that we had to learn all this stuff. You know, we didn't come to Vermont thinking that we were going to change anything, because that wasn't what it was about. We emulated the people in Vermont. The people in Vermont were like wonderfully industrious and resilient people that impressed the hell out of us. So we, you know, when we came in, you know, a lot of people would say, you know, everybody comes, they want to change, they want to modernize everything. You know, that wasn't the case. The mowing machine we used to cut hay was as old as I was. So, and the tractor was just a few years younger. So, you know, we did this farming thing, and it was just enlightening to give that a try, and then working in the woods and doing some logging. So we had all these great experiences that we put together, and just loving to be here, loving the people that were here and that taught us these things. You know, I mean, George Young taught us how to sugar, and Wayne Richardson taught us about animal husbandry. So I had all these great things going on, and we were just richer for it, and we still are. So, you know, I couldn't imagine living anywhere else right now. You know, over the years, we progressed, and we kind of moved out of farming. I worked in community action for a number of years, and for the last 30 years, I worked in a few different law offices in St. Johnsbury, doing public defender work, and that was a rewarding job. I'm just about finished with it right now, and you know, I guess I'll serve in the legislature as long as I get elected, and I'm thrilled to be there. It's wonderful work, and we can take this part of history that I feel, even though I wasn't born here, this great part of history that I feel from being here for 43 years, to the State House, and have an impact and make some difference, and talk to people who are lifelong residents who think the same way that we do, and are looking to benefit the people, the citizens of Vermont, and to do the right thing for the citizens of Vermont. So, you know, that's kind of where I'm at now. It was a great thing to arrive here in 1972, and I'm just going to stay. Thanks.
Next is Judy Carpenter, who is a native Vermonter from St. Johnsbury, right? And she has lived the life of the 70s and the Vermont life for her whole adult life, and maybe as a child as well. She's been an educator in the schools here. She just retired from Craftsbury school system, and has done community action, singing groups, art groups. Go right ahead, Judy. Tell us about it.
My ancestors go back to a Revolutionary War postmaster in East Concord in 1798 and in northern New Hampshire, so at both sides of the Connecticut River. but when I was born, my father was working in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So. But we moved back to Vermont when I
Judy,
was 3.
speak into the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so anyway, I'm an almost native Vermonter. And I grew up spending a lot of time in Bethlehem, New Hampshire, where several generations of my family had lived. And in fact, when I look at our back to the land life with a house that we sort of built ourselves and vegetables and fruits, it looks a heck of a lot like my grandparents and great-grandparents that I grew up with in Bethlehem. And I like what Chip said about the participatory and action that was always in Vermont, because I remember growing up in St. Johnsbury. I remember when Vermont was Republican, when the first Democratic governor got elected in the early 60s, and when the Fairbanks factory was set to close, and the whole town, including my 6th grade class, raised money to try to help keeping them there. And I think my first political demonstration was in 8th grade in St. Johnsbury, when the boys and the science test teacher were dissecting kittens and the girls all protested ever since. So, yeah, and tradition goes way back. But in the middle of the 60s, in the late 60s, when I was in high school, all I wanted to do was get out of here. It was the most boring place, and I wanted to go to the cities. And people started talking about Goddard College, and there was no way I was going to even think about a place 20 miles from home. And I went off to Boston, where one of my college classmates was Jack Laser, who now runs Butterworks Farms. And we were both political science majors in the 60s, and very involved in the anti-war movement and all of that. And I worked in the city for 1 year after college, and was actually working in the governor's office and doing the whole political thing. And I finally said, I don't like it, I'm going back to Vermont. So I moved to Brattleboro, which was at that point in the early 70s, kind of a hotbed of political activity and social activity. I was involved in the founding of the Brattleboro Food Co-op, and Carl and I both volunteered at a 24-hour hotline, and there was a women's center, and there was a free health center, which was run by Carl's brother, and all kinds of things going on, and a lot of idealism, passionate idealism about we can make the world a better place. And I remember we organized all these study groups where people would get together at night, and we would read all kinds of things. We'd read about communism and socialism and the early union movement, and just really searching for ways to get involved and make life better. At one, Brattleboro had a representative system for town meeting. It was big enough then that you elected representatives, and only the representatives went, and I was elected from my neighborhood as a representative. And we were involved in looking into alternative energy issues. We were trying to figure out ways to do, a hydroelectric system, and this was in the mid-70s. And I lived with a couple other women, and one of my roommates was dating this guy who lived down the road and worked for the health center. And he brought his little brother to dinner, and that was Carl. So I met him in Brattleboro in the mid-70s. He had come up from Philadelphia to visit his brother, who had also moved in the Back to the Land movement. And we lived in Brattleboro and did all that for a while, and then decided, well, that's not really Vermont. And so we moved to Lincoln and worked in Middlebury for a year, and that's not really Vermont. And lived in Montpelier for a year, and started looking around St. Johnsbury, just back to this area where my family was, and wanted a piece of land that had water, a view, land that we could till. I had been working for Howie Prusak for a while, one of the early, and I'd worked for Jack Mannix, two of the early organic farmers in the Brattleboro area. And we found all of that in this one piece of land in Greensboro Bend, and we are. And we were members of the Northern Growers Co-op, and not in its earliest days, in the post-George Crane era. and did the growing carrots thing with Leslie Rowell, who lived in our shed before she was Leslie Rowell, and we grew carrots together for 2 or 3 years, and then figured out we're going to do a whole lot better as teachers. So that's what we've done ever since, and have just loved raising our family here.
very representative of the people in this area. Our last speaker is Elka Schumann, and Elka is involved in Bread and Puppet. Everyone knows her. She's the granddaughter of Scott Neary and Helen Neary, who were the gurus of the Back to the Land movement. They wrote their book in the 30s of the Good Life. In the 30s, they were already doing everything that every hippie since then tried to do, and they did it very systematically, and it was really the Bible of the movement. And she will tell you more about that and her life. The Bread and Puppet, of course, is very political and is all about what's happening in politics.
Thank you. Let's see, starting when I did everything that was right up the top.
That way? Like this?
Everything that the Back to the Land did, the more recent Back to the Landers did, only they never smoked and they never drank. So that was a contrast. But, so my connection with Vermont started when I was a little girl, and we visited them. Helen is not my grandmother. My grandmother is Nellie Seeds, Scott's first wife. But Scott and Helen were living in Jamaica, where they built a beautiful stone house, and many other, even the outhouse was made of laid stone. And we visited very regularly with my parents and my sister. But one of the first visits there didn't turn out so well because my mother went into the garden and picked some of the green leaves off the onions to eat on bread. My mother is Russian, coming from a small village, and that was an ordinary kind of food. And Scott was very, he said very sternly, these onions are for storing for the winter, and you can't do that. And my mother, coming from a peasant family where people would give the shirt off their backs to any relative or connection, and they really were so generous and kind. This was a shock for my mother, and there was this kind of disagreement for a while, but came back. We figured it out and came a couple of times a year at least in the summer, and then in the sugaring season we always would come for some of that, to experience that. And when I started in my mid-teens getting interested in politics, of course Scott, as it was a wonderful teacher, and he had so much information about the different political movements all over the world and so many things. So I really was very influenced by him. He had, I guess, I don't know, his initial fame as a professor, teacher, socialist, also politician in the early part of the century had faded, and he was more known for the Back to the Land, is his Living the Good Life book, and the Maple Sugar book about the sugaring experiences he had. But his politics was still very, very strong. But instead of talking in Madison Square Garden, he was going to people's living rooms and talking there about his political beliefs and ideology. And he went to the Putney School and wrote me a letter after that and said how impressed he was by the Putney School in Vermont, how interested the students were, what good questions they had. And at that time in my Ridgefield, Connecticut high school, it was the silent 50s, and no mention of politics was made at all. And that interested me about the Putney School, so I ended up going there for my senior year, and then 10 years later I went back to teach Russian for a year when the Russian teacher left on sabbatical. we lived in New York City, and we had our 5 children there in a railroad flat on the Lower East Side, and sort of longed in an idealistic way to one day move to the country and grow our own vegetables and just enjoy country life instead of being in the city. Our theater, which was founded in 1963, very quickly became involved in the protest movements against the Vietnam War, and the involvement grew, and the puppets grew bigger, and more people joined into our part of the demonstrations against the war, and many of the shows that were created in the 60s were a reaction or had that theme of being against the war. But we didn't have any very realistic plan to move to the country, but Goddard College extended an invitation, and that was thanks to Jules Rabin, who had been part of our company in New York for a while. He was a professor of anthropology there and got us invited to be a theater in residence. And there it was just out of the blue and a wonderful opportunity to do what we have been dreaming about. And the college gave us a beautiful farm, Cake Farm, which is now, I think, a well-known farm for growing organic vegetables and herbs. And it's not right in the college, it's by itself. The buildings are on a rise, there's a barn, and then a flat field in the end of the Winooski River. And when Peter saw that, my husband, he said, instead of touring in the summer, let's tour in the fall, winter, and spring, and then spend the summers creating one big performance, one big show that'll be done once a summer. And that was called Our Domestic Resurrection Circus. And it began in a kind of experimental way, but by 1974, it had really gotten a very a pretty figured out form of little shows, then a central circus with a live band and dancing and music and political acts and goofy acts, whatever, beautiful music and so on, and then followed by a pageant, a wordless procession of big puppets. They were with themes, sort of maybe mystical or hard to understand things, but something's very visual that would roll across the landscape, and the audience sat on one side and just watched this panorama going by. And that form stayed on for the next 25 until 1998 anyway. And we were very happy there. We worked together with students. That was from 1970 to 74, and it definitely was the Back to the Land movement again. But I forgot to say that when my grandfather, Scott, moved to Vermont in the early 30s, to Jamaica, that was part of a Back to the Land movement then. There was a real interest in getting out of the city, growing your own food, and there are many authors whose names I can't remember who wrote books like Living the Good Life that urged people to live that better life in the country. So at Cake Farm, quite often when I was in the garden or something, we would see one thinking they could join this group that was doing theater and interesting things, and some of them did and stayed on for some years, but there was a real sort of not an invasion, but a migration, definitely out of cities, out of other parts of the United States, up from north. After 4 years at Goddard, the college told us that they had actually not invited us to stay forever, but this was temporary faculty housing, and we had stayed for had our stay, and now they needed the space for the next faculty. Although we weren't faculty, the arrangement was really nice. It was very, we worked with students, they worked with us, some of them became members of the company. We premiered all our shows in the Hay Barn Theater. Tried out our street shows on the campus and so on, so it was a very nice arrangement. No money was exchanged. Then at that time, at the same time that we realized we had to leave, my parents had bought a farm in the Northeast Kingdom in Glover, thinking to leave the more suburban life in Connecticut and move to the real country. My father loved to build, having inherited that probably from Scott. He loved building with stone, and he had dreams of big projects there. But after a couple of years, they realized it was just more work, especially dealing with an old farm building and a huge barn that was, parts of it were rotting and needed work and so on. And so they very generously gifted it to us, and for us, just as we needed to find another place, here was this beautiful farm available. The barn was the perfect place for the puppets to be stored and displayed as in the museum. There was this huge field with a gravel pit that had been dug to build Interstate 91, and we started made the move and began the summer domestic resurrection circuses in 1975. Right then, my questions.
Talk a little bit about Daisy Dock.
Daisy Dock, yes, indeed. The farm where we live now, that was the Dock farm. Daisy Dock was Sherburne, and her parents and grandparents had lived there, so she was the third generation in this beautiful 240-acre farm. Jim Dock, her husband, had been a hired hand, and they had no children, but they had a lot of connections in the community, and their hired hands were almost, I think, like part of the family. And they raised, on the farm, when the barn was built in 1863, it was this prosperous time for Vermont, because this was sheep country, wool country, and wool was needed for the Civil War, for the soldiers' uniforms and blankets. So they could afford to build this humongous 100-foot-long, 3-story barn. It fit our needs so well. And Daisy, besides being a very involved farmer and met all the aspects of the farm work, they also had a big sugaring operation, and first sheep, then cows and chickens, and their own garden. And she also wrote articles for the Newport Daily Express. Very nice articles. I collected some of them in the Vermont, Orleans County Historical Society, put them into a book, which is out of print, but it's full of these stories of growing up and living and working on a Vermont Northeast Kingdom farm. And she was very sweet, and I was so happy that I got to talk to her and get to know her. And she kind of would say things like, you know that well on the east side of the house? Well, sure, look at it. There are all these copper pipes, and I didn't know what she was talking about, but I think it was a still, right? And then she was carrying mash down to the chicken coop, down a flight of stairs, and he slipped down the stairs and landed on a chicken that would always limp afterwards. Very nice. So I'm very honored that I gotten to know her.
Elka, could you talk about when and how you learned about shape note singing?
Oh yeah, because that was one of the big influences for me, but also for Vermont Theater. When we moved to Vermont, to Plainfield, to Carpenter College, 2 young men came to Cape Farm and brought this music with them. Larry Gordon, who was from Boston and was living in Plainfield, and Alan Foxler from North Carolina. And this music is called shape note music, and the main book that is used is The Sacred Harp, and it's 4-part unaccompanied songs. And it's a marvelous tradition. As soon as we heard it, even though the words are very, very pious, many of the lyrics are written by Isaac Watts. I'll call it from the earlier times, but a lot of his poems are used in the songs, and they're all about guilt and redemption, and some of the favorite phrases are, "for such a worm's eye," and we're not religious in that way, but the music is just so powerful, and it's a combination of old, not old-time folksy music. It's more like Renaissance or medieval music, and a kind of folk music. The people who composed it were not professional musicians. They were farmers and craftspeople, and they were also musical, so they wrote this 4-part music and traveled around as singing masters, mostly in the fall, teaching young people, and to keep them off the streets, keep them busy. This music, and it's not concert music, it's not meant for being performed, it's sung in a square, the singers all face each other in a square, and it's sung for the joy and pleasure of the music and the singing. And we immediately took to it, learned several of the songs, and incorporated them in a number of our shows, and still continue to do that. Like last Sunday, at the end of the pageant, a shape note song was sung, and for the last quite a few years, every July and August, we have a sing on Tuesday evening at 7:30 in the building behind the museum, and everyone is welcome. You can come and sing if you'd like, or just listen and get a sense of this old tradition. And the tradition has continued because even though most of or a great number of the songs were written in the late 1700s and 1800s and into the 1930s and 50s, but because of Larry's work with Village Harmony and Northern Harmony, he sets up summer camps, and a number of very young people in their teens and early 20s have composed their own sacred harp and shape note music, sometimes using old texts, sometimes their own. So it's a really powerful tradition that has been revived. So that's, I don't know if there's more questions. Anybody else have any questions for any of our panelists?
A very good picture of what has been going on here since the 60s and 70s, and is still going on. It just hasn't left the area. Does anybody else in the audience, well, do you have questions for anyone up here, first of all? Yes, Nancy.
I heard that Chip lived in the house where Bernie Sanders does.
Chip lived in the house
Yeah,
with
we're going to do
Bernie
tours, $20 a piece. No, actually I don't. I live around the corner from there.
Oh, okay.
It's the Yanakaitis who live in the house.
Thank you.
Yes.
He has all the skeleton.
Yeah.
Burning in his book.
I have the rights to the tour, though.
Everybody knows that Bernie Sanders is from Standard or lived there a long time during this period when all three was here. Yes, Dan.
Jim, how did you get involved in politics itself? You know, what was the process that got you into it?
Oh, to me? Well, the first town meeting I went to, again, I was really impressed by, just the local elections. So my first town meeting in March of 1973, I was elected lister, and I still am. So for 43 years, I've been doing that. And then the second town meeting, I was elected moderator. And I've always said, all it takes to be moderator is be able to read and have a loud voice. So I qualified on those two. And I've been moderator for the last 42 years. So this year I gave it up because I have to go to 30 town meetings. But I always had an interest in politics. And it just came. And again, I thought that it was a privilege and a duty to serve your town in that respect. And I continue that notion that, we really have to partake in our local government. It's the right thing to do. So that kind of got me going.
Elka.
Well, when we were doing our Back to the Land thing, I noticed the difference between now and then was, one of the things was that the infrastructure for farming, for example, was still in place here. There was a freezer locker, people who cut up meat in East Hardwick, there's a slaughterhouse in Hardwick. I'm sure none of these places would pass inspection now, but there were places you could take your tractor to get fixed in Hardwick. The grain is pretty close. The whole supporting thing that you need to do the kind of farming we were doing, which was small scale, was still in place. And I think that kind of went out to some degree. And I don't know. I know they're talking about that there aren't enough slaughterhouses now. They're trying to remedy that. And there's also a whole lot more ways you have to do things that you didn't have to do things back in those days, and none of us died, so, well, some of us probably died. But, everything has to be stainless steel and very pricey to do anything, so I think that's one of the big differences that I noticed about then and now.
One of the things I didn't talk about in Chip did was talking about the neighbors helping, and we moved in. And the first thing we were doing was we were building a shed that we were going to live in for temporarily, and we were pouring cement posts, and it started to rain, and all of a sudden this guy shows up and says, "I see it's raining, and I brought some plastic to cover up your holes." And that was the beginning of our relationship with the Dunbars, who had 8 kids, grown-up kids, and immediately adopted us as their 9th and 10th. And Uncle Glenn and Aunt Mary to our kids, and every household or tractor or vehicle or any kind of problem we ever had, Glenn knew how to solve. And you could say something about that, Carl.
Well, not only did he know how to solve, but he knew when they happened before we picked up the phone. Mary finally told us that was because he kept an eye on us through the scope of the 30-30.
I saw you out on the porch in your nightgown the other day. When their backyard would flood, we would call up and say, "You want to borrow the canoe?" And on April 1st, there was usually some kind of prank. And I think that's the kind of relationships that happen around here with the older residents and the younger residents. And we're still very connected to the Dunbar tribe. And, I don't think we could have done without them. And then, of course, they moved on, and now suddenly on our hill, a few years ago, we got new neighbors. And they're just as great old Vermonter neighbors who help us solve all the problems of Tucson. So it just goes on and on, the interactions.
I attended the Vermont Historical Society gathering in the townhouse in Hardwick, and was impressed on a series of themes there that, while you have touched on, haven't gotten into as much detail, and perhaps I could stimulate a little more discussion in that regard. That some of the themes that I remember, people came up here for organic farming. and you've mentioned carrots and your approach, but there seemed to be a real movement in that sense. A lot of people came up. People came up for communes, to be free and to do their own thing. I was impressed by gender issues. There were several lesbian that got up and talked about how they came because it was a free society up here. And I got a sense that from that this was for the 70s, that Vermont was a considerably different place than some of what we see today. I don't know if maybe, Judy, you touched a bit on the neighbors being helpful was a major theme as well, I think. But
Yeah.
whether some of these other themes, the organic farming that you talked about, Mr. Allen, but also the commune movement and the whole question of sexual freedom.
Well, we certainly, there were communes all over, and we were not ever lived in one, but we're friends with people who lived in communes in the Brattleboro area. And people were trying to buy a big piece of land and farm it and live together, and in their little houses. And
how many still exist?
I don't think very many still exist. A lot of the people who were there are still around, and some of them are still living on those places. And they were, there was a commune south of Brattleboro that was incredibly artistic. Peter Gould lived there, who people probably know from Gould and Stearns as a performer, and he does the Shakespeare Festival in Craftsbury, lived there. And Miranda Porch, who's a fairly well-known poet, and they would put on these Shakespeare performances in the field, and revived a play by Royal Tyler, which I think Garb did a few years ago and said they were the first revival, and I remember seeing a revival of it in the 70s in this field in Brattleboro, and brought there was a lot of artistic people, and we knew gay people and lesbians, and they were part of the community, and there was just no, I think Vermont has always been a live and let live state. And this is much later, but I remember when the whole civil union thing was going on, that going with my 13-year-old daughter to the debate in the State House, where people came and they had all the speakers, and there were so many people there, we didn't even get into the main hall, and we were in the basement. And you think of the divisiveness that can happen and that kind of thing, because there were the church groups who were totally opposed and the people who were in favor. And everybody was sitting all mixed together incredibly civilly, which you don't hear other places. And I think that tradition goes way far back, and people came and didn't bring it, but joined it.
Whether, Mr. Troiano, you ran into this, for example, the signs that appeared on lawns a few years back, Take Back Vermont, and how you may have been exposed to that kind of feeling from some of your constituents.
Well, I wasn't in office at that time, but I remember it was a very contentious time. That was a real movement, the Take Back Vermont. The complexion of the legislature changed after the civil unions vote, in that a number of people lost their seats who supported it. So, as Judy said, it was it was religious and moral objection to it. But for instance, the farm that we bought in Stannard was occupied by two gay men before we bought it. And there were times when one of them be strolling down Hutchins Farm Road with a house dress on, and nobody paid much attention to it. And that's an absolute factual story. But things did change, but and for the better or worse, I don't know. But Take Back Vermont has and I didn't partake in that particular debate. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the organic farming piece that you brought up. Was that it seemed to us that again, that connection that we wanted to make with the land. I mean, back to the land. It was we were going to raise our own meat. We were going to grow our own vegetables. That connection was very important to us. So at the same time, for me and, for many people, Dow Chemical and the Agent Orange predicament as a result of the Vietnam War was on the forefront of our minds, for sure. So the notion that we would use any chemicals to forward our farming efforts was never even a possibility. I mean, organic farming was we just kind of, that was a natural thing to go in there and grow the way they grew it, 200 years ago. Again, that respect for the land, the respect for the people, and the resilience of the farmers, and the work that they did. My first job was picking hay, picking bales out of a field for Wayne Richardson for 10 cents a bale. And the next year we had farmers knocking on our door, you come and pick hay for us. And we knew we were working too cheap at that point. So we took up another line at that point. So, and I realized I wasn't really a farmer. So but we still plant a large vegetable, and we still have that connection, and we still, hay our fields and cut our wood and do the things that traditionally make us feel good and make us feel part of the community.
Well, the Vermont Natural and Organic Farmers Association, NOFA, started, and I don't know, you were probably involved with that in the early
days,
70s, and I was involved with that, and started having summer conferences and bringing in all kinds of people for workshops, and all kinds of people would come, and people would share their knowledge and bring in experts, and they still have. Now it's combined, it's a much bigger organization, and it did a lot to spread information and connect people, and still has summer and winter conferences and a lot of education. So that was another thing that got started in the 70s. Somebody new here.
So you mentioned that you were a very thoughtful group, and you had meetings, and you read literature, political literature, and you thought about how to change the world. How do you think the movement of people, particularly people from out of state who had been educated in various universities and came here to go back to the land and farm, how did they influence education, public education in Vermont, or did they?
That's a good question. I wasn't a teacher at that point, so I didn't start teaching until about 1980.
So Judy,
What do you want to say about
that? I mean, the 70s was when the movement to integrate that Brandon, that was the first where the shutting down of Brandon started to be discussed, and integration of people with learning impairments and learning disabilities and behavior problems.
Yeah.
So that was the very beginning of that movement, and I think that the people who, I don't think it was just people who came in. Again, I think it was an openness to look at different possibilities and different options. Plus, there were some horror stories that came out in the 70s because of some political people who were looking into those things and exposing them. So I think that
That's true. Vermont was a national leader in that.
Right.
And Carl and I both worked at a mental health facility in Bellas Falls, where a lot of these people who had come out of Brandon were living in community homes.
What was Brandon?
Brandon was the state training school for the retarded in Brandon, Vermont. And, before the 70s.
There were two, Brandon Training School for the learning impaired, and then the Wheat School.
That was behavioral.
Behavioral problem.
Yeah. And Vermont has always been a national leader in integrating children in the schools. And I think some of that came from young educated people who were social workers and teachers, and could be Vermonters as much as people coming in, but I think that definitely happened.
Erica was involved in the preschool in Greensboro. Bend was a cooperative school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was no tuition or fee, and everyone did their share of some fundraising and work. Erica was a teacher there for a long time.
I was going to say that, well,
I went to graduate school in Putney and got a master's in teaching and in 68, I guess. And because education was really changing in those days. There were the infant schools from England and all kinds of, exciting things going, not just in Vermont, but everywhere. But Vermont wasn't quite ready for some of that. And so we couldn't get jobs in southern Vermont because they knew we had that persuasion. And so that's one of the reasons we came north, because they didn't know about Antioch. My first job was teaching in Wheelock, which was 69, I guess, or 70, and it was really scary. There were books with, reading series with black and white kids on the cover, and the kids would say, I ain't reading that book with no nigger in it. And, I just didn't know how to handle it. It was way beyond my expertise, because it was a whole culture that I just wasn't able to deal with. But, eventually we all kind of moved along, and I guess hopefully we've come a long way. But I think there was a huge divide between some of the people that came in from outside and some of the old ways that were still going on. Especially up here in the Northeast. Maybe the southern part of the state was a little more cosmopolitan. I don't know. Closer to.
I taught at Burlington High School, started in 69, and we had one of the first classes in the state that I team taught with the other teachers, environmental studies. And we had a class of like 80 kids, and we had field trips and projects, and we did a ton of Willie Hunt from the Perron Farm was in that class. I just went to his 60th birthday, and you're old when your students turn 60.
I wondered from Elka if you could reflect a little bit on the audiences that you attract, because I've seen some of the bread and puppet performers in Washington in protests down there. The classic paper mache head, large head on those workers that do the scattering around working on the site when you're at the old gravel pit. But to see them in Washington, to know that they're coming from the Glover area, it's just the very wide reputation and the number of people you attract for your pageant and circus.
I think the puppets just in themselves and their size and their variety attract curious people or kids and so on, even though our shows are rarely, specifically made to be children's shows. But in our area, there are a lot of people who live, just down the road or very nearby who've never been to our museum or to our two shows, and they're not hostile, but they just are not interested. But that going into towns for parades has been a great way to not reach out, but to sort of to connect with people. And Peter makes a joke that when a lot of people sit in their cars and watch a parade, and if they like what they see, they roll their window down a little bit and kind of. There's an acceptance and also this live and let live philosophy that they don't bother us and they don't,
I just want to reflect on one thing. It was the summer we came over. And I worked for the U.S. Agency International Development, and there was a big sign with AID among all the other government agencies that you were about to burn. And
they still will. I was thinking, and they've been looking for you ever since.
Well, when I brought my father over from Holland to live here with me, he had been in the tradition in Holland of Bertolt Brecht and all those East German theater people. And when he saw Bread and Puppet, he was completely enamored of them. I think I went to every performance for 2 summers straight with wheelchairs, with Elka helping me carry paraphernalia, he was sure that the garbage men were actually running the show. And we didn't listen, whatever you say, we told him that was right. So this is yet another whole different type of person, somebody from Europe who has lived in that tradition, the Bertolt tradition, to come to Vermont, nowhere Vermont, and find that tradition here alive and well. So that was very exciting for him.
I just want to, about Bread and Puppet. Bread and Puppet was really important to our family because it provided us an opportunity for our children to interact with other people from around the world and to help build these big puppets and to help work in the print shop and to be part of the circus, to learn how to walk on stilts, to be garbage men. And so that's what we did. That was our summer. We would spend our summers up at Bread and Puppet every weekend, practicing, rehearsing, creating, paper mache. And our children were free to run around and interact with other children of other families, and all came together with the circus, and we traveled with the circus to Shelburne and to other areas and put the circus on. It was an incredible experience for our family and one that we treasure, and our children still talk about it.
Thank you. I would second that. It was incredibly transformative for our family.
Us as well.
But there's a quick story about that my niece, my twin sister had 7 children, and all of them were very theater oriented, and my niece came to visit us one summer, and Adina, and then went to Israel, to live in Israel, to go to the theater school there. And the first project they had to do was to write about one of 7, and we never got her up to Bread and Puppet. She kept on having excuses why. And then she gets there, and she had to write one of 7 influential theater groups in the world.
In the 20th century.
In the 20th century, and one of them was Bread and Puppet. And we got this phone call going, "Why didn't you make me go?"
Now, when we were first at the lodge in the 80s, I would overhear people who had just happened upon the Bread and Puppet Theater, and they went to see it. It was still the big show in the field, and I overheard them talking on the phone saying, "There are still hippies up here. It's just like they used to be." And there still are.
My father went looking for a tractor tire one time, the old Ford. He was driving around, just trying to find a place, and he came back and he started telling me about this barn in Glover that he'd stopped at. He was telling about going into the barn, and then the gentleman was inviting him in and said, "Well, we don't farm here any longer. This is a circus and a museum." And was taking him in, and he said the further he got into the barn, the more afraid he became. He was sure he was not getting out of it. And I said, "Oh, you were Bread and Puppet." And he goes, "Yeah, the guy kept saying that." So he was glad to get out of it.
Well, Bread and Puppet is on many levels. If you've seen the shows, and you can read everything you want to in the shows.
Well, in Barton, we've been going to the 4th of July parade since we moved here, but one time we had a part of our parade was a sign and commemorating the United States had shot down an Iran plane, and over 200 people were killed, and we had made a part of the parade about that, and afterwards we were told, "Don't do it again, we won't invite you anymore." And it's not that we weren't going to do it again, but we tried to be more, to address more general themes. I don't even know if that's true.
Politically correct.
Let's not go that far. Like I say, people like the band, they like the still dancing, and the political things. The garbage man marshal we've been running around with signs doesn't have to, be the major thing there.
Don't stop.
Well, I think it's
Peter's
fascinating.
off the stilts now.
But the international nature of it, and it's like Bobby said, the kids would meet people from Puerto Rico and Czechoslovakia and Bosnia during the Bosnian War and Russia and everywhere that you just don't have that experience around you.
I think with these 4 people, we've seen pretty much a cross-section of Vermont, and it hasn't really changed that much since the 70s. It's still going, and I'm really glad to be here. I'm sure all of you are too.
I just want to make a disclaimer that last poster is not a church poster, even though it's on a church.
Now great for all these posters, which are great for the
But can somebody explain the history of that poster? Is that from the eugenics period, which is not the proudest part of Vermont's history, that eugenics began in Vermont?
I am a pack rat and collect things from wherever, and I'm not entirely sure where any of these came from. But it reflected some people's thinking back then. And I think this is sort of a spectrum of different thinking as you look at some of these posters. They're not totally representative of everything, but give some idea of the kind of, I don't know, sort of an anti-feeling against certain establishment institutions.
Any other questions? Please come up and talk with our panelists, talk with each other, have some goodies, and there's 2 lemonade in that cooler there. And David will accompany it all with 70's music.